All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Kyle Lanslone Show. We have a full episode to get through today. I had a full episode to talk about before, but then just before I start recording this show, we had a big announcement from President Trump that we absolutely have to start off today's show talking about. He says that he held a call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. In fact, he put out this post on Truth Social. I just had a lengthy and high productive phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. We both reflected on the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought successfully together in World War II, remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people, and we likewise lost so many. We each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. But first, as we both agreed, we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia-Ukraine. President Putin even used my very strong campaign motto of common sense. We both believe very strongly in it. We agreed to work together very closely, including visiting each other's nations. We have also agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately, and will begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I will be doing right now. And so I wanted to read that whole thing, and I know it was a lot because it was so clear. And it was so sensible, and it was a very positive and good message, and the exact kind of thing that I would want my president to say if he was about to enter into very serious negotiations with Russia, wanted to get things off on the right foot. If you read this entire post, and I know some of you are probably listening and not watching, you didn't see when we had the post up there on screen, the only words that were in all caps were common sense. All of Trump's other Truth Social posts, every other word is in all caps. Some of them, the entire post is in all caps. There's exclamation points, commas everywhere that don't make sense. He repeats himself. He adds things that are unrelated to the actual important subject matter. He made threats, but this was clear. It was direct. It was positive. I was really encouraged by this. And I think I've been fairly skeptical if Trump was actually going to enter into serious negotiations with Russia and be able to get something done. So we did have earlier in the day a statement come out that said the Kremlin had invited Trump to Russia, and Trump did mention in there. I thought that was absurd, but we had Trump mention in there was an agreement to visit each other's nations. I have no idea how that's going to be worked out and take place. The Biden administration was trying to arrest the Vladimir Putin for war crimes and ship him off to The Hague. And so that Trump would invite Putin to the United States would be huge. It would be a massive step in the right direction. Remember, we are talking about the war in Ukraine and ending the war in Ukraine, and that alone would be worth bringing Putin to America for. But we're talking about the most important geopolitical relationship on the face of the planet, the two largest nuclear armed superpowers and the two most likely to go to war with each other at this point in time. The United States and Russia need to sit down and talk, and not just about the war in Ukraine, but about force posture in Europe, the military exercises, the war games going on, the buildups on each other's borders. This has to be toned down. This has to be ramped down. And this kind of statement suggests that Trump is willing to talk about all that. Additionally, we are a year away from the New START treaty expiring. That's the last remaining arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. During Trump's first administration, he killed two really important nuclear, or not nuclear, but arms control agreements. The Open Skies Treaty, which was a monitoring agreement, and the INF Treaty, which eliminated missiles with a range of, I believe, 500 miles or kilometers. And so it took essentially Europe off the map for having ballistic missiles deployed there that would be lobbed at each other in event of a nuclear war. And so these were really positive agreements that were undone during the first Trump administration. And when Trump took office, it looked really bleak that we would extend New START and we would essentially now be in a world where there's no nuclear arms treaty between the United States and Russia, and who knows what we could see, what kind of advances, putting nuclear weapons in space and absolutely insane and dangerous things that could happen if there's no cap on arms control. And so this taught these visits are going to happen are positive, because we're not just talking about the war in Ukraine, which is absolutely important. People are dying there every single day. That fighting does need to end. The Ukrainian government is not conscripting their 18-year-olds now, but they are giving them a $24,000 signing bonus to try to get them to sign up, because they're so desperate for people to send into the meat grinder. It seems that Zelensky's willing to sell off his country's natural resources to Trump, willing to give the United States $500 billion in Ukrainian rare earths in exchange for continued U.S. weapons shipments to Ukraine. And so there's a real chance that these negotiations are not successful. This could get uglier and uglier for the Ukrainians. No matter how many weapons we get them, no matter how many troops they train, Russia will have escalation dominance in Ukraine. No matter how far the West ramps up their support for Kiev, Moscow could increase and has a military capabilities, resources, manpower depth that Ukraine simply cannot match. And so eventually Ukraine will lose this war. It just depends on how much they're going to lose between now and then. And so getting a deal done sooner is the only thing that could really help the Ukrainians. And again, I think this is the first step I've seen in the right direction. Now, the last thing I'll mention on this is in the second part of the Trump statement. He mentions who's on his negotiating team. And the real downside is I saw Marco Rubio on the list and Rick Grenell isn't on the list. And so I think that's unfortunate. I think Grenell is probably one of the more intelligent people in the Trump administration. Tulsi Gabbard's another one, although I'm not sure that would be something you would typically see out of the national security advisor. Rubio's the threat, Rubio's the hawk, but also Keith Kellogg was left off the list. And this may be a positive thing because he is Trump's personal envoy to the conflict. At the same time, he is a hawk on the issue. And so maybe he has been marginalized and has fallen out of favor with Trump. So that's what I had today on the war in Ukraine. Now I want to get into what I really have planned for you guys today, which I think is a really important subject. And I think today's show, I'm really going to try to lay out kind of what I think is going to happen going forward with the Israel-U.S. relationship during the Trump administration and what it means for the Palestinians. And I started thinking about this after I saw this clip from Jesse Waters explaining and saying really something that isn't said enough, but is really the problem that Israel has with the Palestinians. So let's go ahead and play our first clip today.
This population in Palestine is hostile. It's uneducated. It's even more radicalized than they were at the beginning of this. I mean, now they have no homes at all. They're even more hateful of the Israelis. And their birth rate is explosive. The average Palestinian woman has 5.5 babies. The average Israeli woman has only 2.5 babies. So demographically, they're a threat, not to mention the national security threat. There is no way you can have these two peoples living side by side.
So what he says is something, while really ignorant, really stupid, really uneducated. You know, his assessment of the Palestinian people is really disgusting. But the point that he makes in there is really a point that Israel has to contend with, which is that demographically, there's more Palestinians than there are Israelis in the territory that Israel wants to control, and Palestinians have children at a higher rate than Israelis. And so if Israel wants to be the liberal democracy of the Middle East that it pretends to be, it has to first remove at least a very significant number of the Palestinians from the territory it wants to control, because it cannot give Palestinian people equal rights, because then Israel will not be the Jewish state. A democracy that's a majority Palestinian will not be a Jewish state, but that's what Israel wants the land between the river and the sea to be, the Jewish state, the state for the Jewish people. They, you know, claim it's their, they go back to the Bible. This is our ancestral homeland. This is our territory. And so what does that mean if you have a demographic problem? If you have a demographic issue, that means that you have to kill, that you have to displace, you have to ethnically cleanse, you have to commit a genocide in order to solve that problem. And so if Israel wants to be a democracy and to give one people, one vote, the first thing they have to do to maintain their status as a Jewish state is to expel the Palestinians. Now, this is why I suggest that the real solution here is a one-state solution where we, get rid of the walls that separate Gaza and the rest of Israel. We get rid of the, isolated pockets of the Palestinians in the West Bank, and we just treat everybody between the river and the sea as an equal person. Everybody has equal rights. They go out and vote, and then what happens from there. And of course, you don't get, if the Palestinians take power, that doesn't mean that they get to then do a reverse of what the Israelis did to them. That would be absolutely horrific and something to oppose and to stand against. But for a country to have equal rights for everyone, for the people that live there, is what you should want to happen. But what the Israelis want to happen is they want to remove the Palestinians from the land so they could have the land, so they could have their liberal democracy of the Middle East, their Jewish democracy, and not have to worry about the fact that there were once people that lived there, that this was their homeland, that this is where their ancestors had lived, that they were living in their grandparents' house, that you came, that you stole, that you destroyed. And so when you're talking about carrying out a genocide, I think in the United States, and for good reason, everybody just immediately goes to the Holocaust, right? This is our founding mythology in this country, World War II. And when you think of genocide and the Holocaust, you think of the Nazis marching the Jews off into the gas chambers and just rounding them up and systematically killing them. And of course, that is the most horrific thing that you could do. And that is certainly a genocide. However, that's not how most genocides work. Most genocides work by a midst of ethnic cleansing and genocide, where a group of people, a group of militants will enter a village that they want to cleanse, and they will kill maybe all the men and then allow the women to flee, or they will commit mass rapes and things like that, or select atrocities. You don't have to kill everyone. You just have to make it clear to the remaining people that your option is to have yourself, your family absolutely destroyed in the most horrific and cruel way, or you could leave and go live somewhere else. And typically what happens when people are displaced and forced to live somewhere else, there's, a lot of poverty, there's no infrastructure, and slowly the complete society really melts away, and everybody either dies off or relocates and just becomes, a part of another country, a part of another people. And you have a slower kind of genocide, a slower kind of elimination. This is something that Daryl Cooper did a really good job of laying out in his first part of his Coming to Jerusalem or Palestine series that he did on the conflict. I really check it out. It's the Martyr Made podcast. I highly recommend that. And we are seeing those atrocities being committed right now, not in Gaza, but in the West Bank. So now I want to go to this article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The headline is, Israel expands open fire order in West Bank, resulting in surge of civilian killings. And so Dave writes, one of the orders allows Israeli troops to fire on unarmed Palestinians if they are, quote unquote, messing with the ground. The other order allows Israeli troops to open fire on any vehicles approaching Israeli military checkpoints that are leaving combat zones to force them to stop. Since the combat zones are residential areas, this means the IDF can open fire on civilians trying to flee. Sources told Haaretz that a husband and wife were killed. The husband was shot and killed while driving near Tulkrum, and the wife was shot dead after managing to get out of the car. According to the IDF investigation, the wife was a pregnant woman who was shot because she, this was a quote, looked suspiciously at the ground. No weapons or explosives were found in the car, which was carrying the two children. And so think about this. A husband and wife are driving with their two children in the back seat. The husband is shot and killed. The wife gets out of the car. She's pregnant. She gets killed in front of the children. I mean, imagine if you're another Palestinian family. I'm sure you really do have to consider, is it time to try to leave the West Bank, to flee to another country? Because if we can't even drive around and there's military checkpoints all over the place in the West Bank, we could be gunned down at any time in front of our children. And if certainly that puts the children at risk. Now, if that story did not sound horrific enough, it actually gets a lot worse. So when the Palestinian woman the pregnant woman was shot, she was on the ground bleeding, and paramedics attempted to get to her. And this was reported by Israeli sources. It was in the Associated Press that on 2 occasions, the paramedics were detained for a half hour at a time, so delayed for an hour while the woman bled out and her unborn baby died. So again, these are just absolutely horror stories. You can't imagine this happening anywhere. You think it has to be a lie when you read something like this, but it's reported from all sources on all sides. And why would the Israelis do something so horrific as watch a pregnant woman bleed out on the ground while her unborn baby dies? Because it sends a message to every other Palestinian in the West Bank that this could happen to you, that this could be your wife, your daughter, your child that dies in this horrific fashion. And if anybody in your family is shot, forget thinking that an ambulance will ever get there. So next up in Dave's article, he talks about this story. IDF troops shot a 2-year-old girl in the head while she was inside a house eating dinner with her family. And so, I mean, a sniper is a large bullet. We are talking about this little girl's head essentially being blown off at her dinner table in front of her family. Again, if you are another Palestinian family, if you're one of their neighbors, I mean, I would absolutely flee. There is no way I would keep my family in that situation. I mean, that is just another unbelievable horror in the time and time again in the West Bank. This next one on Saturday, a 7-year-old boy died of wounds he sustained from Israeli gunfire 10 days earlier. The boy was shot over the claim that he was, quote, messing with the ground. Now, I don't know if any of you remember being 7 years old, but I was a 7-year-old boy, and basically all I did is went outside and messed with the ground. I dug holes. I thought I was going to find dinosaur bones in my backyard. And the fact that anybody could kill a 7-year-old boy for playing in the dirt is just so disgusting and almost unbelievable. But when you read these stories time and time again, and year after year after year, you understand that when Jesse Waters is talking about one of the societies being radicalized, he should be talking about the Israelis who have just committed atrocity after atrocity. And we're talking about the West Bank now, but certainly all of this has happened in Gaza as well. And then this last one, the report said another Palestinian woman, a 21-year-old, was killed on Sunday by an explosive charge placed at the entrance of her home that was placed by the IDF. The Israeli troops placed the charge after they ordered anyone inside to leave over claims that a terrorist was inside. The explosives was sent off when she opened the door. And so this is just simply terrorism, right? If any Palestinian had planted an explosive on the door of any Israeli, and some Israeli woman, a 21-year-old woman, I'm sure a young, beautiful woman, opened the door to have herself blown up, blown to pieces. I'm sure, her family left to pick up the pieces of her body. Everybody would recognize it as terrorism. Everybody would be horrified. People would be demanding action and end to the violence. But because it's a Palestinian woman, it's just another day in the West Bank, another Israeli atrocity, backed and completely underwritten by the United States of America. Now, why is this happening right now? And why do I think that basically during the Trump administration, Netanyahu is going to do everything he can to expel every Palestinian he can from Gaza and the West Bank and expand Israel's borders as much as they can? Well, let's go to this map of the Middle East and North Africa. Right now, the situation in the region is geopolitically the best it's ever going to get for Israel if your goal is to carry out an ethnic cleansing. If you start with Libya, this is a state that when Muammar Gaddafi was in charge may have stood up to Israel. I don't know if he would have launched attacks, but certainly Libya would have been objecting to what Israel was doing, maybe interfering as the Houthis are, at least trying to interfere with some Israeli shipping or things like that. However, Libya has been turned into an absolute complete failed state. Ethiopia, Somalia, also 2 other states in the region who could stand up, who could oppose what Israel is doing. Have Somalia is an absolute failed state. Ethiopia recently underwent a civil war. The Egyptians and the Jordanians are both states that their governments are propped up and funded by the United States government to the extent that we're essentially standing next to a life support machine. And if we pull the plug at any time, it's just a matter of time before the King of Jordan or the general in charge of Egypt will be overthrown. Those two governments exist at the allowance of the United States of America, because we give them aid, because we give them money, because we give them weapons, because we allow them to ruthlessly oppress their citizens every time that they stand up and either demand more rights for themselves or demand that their government stand up to what Israel is doing. If you look again surrounding Israel, you have Syria, another state that the United States carried out regime change against Bashar al-Assad, a government that certainly may have stood up against what Israel was doing. Syria had their own territorial issues with Israel after they stole the Golan Heights. And so, of course, if there's major wars going on in and around Israel, if Bashar al-Assad wasn't weakened by a decade-long dirty war waged by the United States, where we propped up literal terrorists who now control Damascus to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, another government could have stood up. Lebanon, we've helped the Israelis completely decimate southern Lebanon and Hezbollah, one of the main fighting forces in the region. If you look at the Gulf Arab states like the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, much like the Egyptians and the Jordanians, now these countries have maybe more of their own independent wealth, but the Saudis have invested hundreds of billions of dollars, the Emiratis at least tens of billions of dollars in buying weapons and influence in Washington. And so now they have American-made military. So I'm not quite sure that, the American forces on the Saudi bases are going to allow them to take off in American-made warplanes and go bomb Israel. And so in that way, Riyadh and Dubai really can't do much here. But in another way, they've invested a lot in becoming a part of the United States empire, the American-led world order. And I really don't think that they're willing to trade those investments to stand up for the Palestinians at this point. And so that really leaves in the region of all these countries surrounding Israel, just Iran and then the Houthis in Yemen. And of course, Yemen's been under a decades-long blockade themselves, a ruthless air war which waged by the Saudis against the Houthis for a decade and decimated the civilian population there. So, that's another country that, has stood up, has tried to interfere, but really is limited in their capabilities. And when you look at Iran and the threats that the United States and Israel make at Iran, Tehran is basically left with the option of, if they interfere, they could lose tens of millions of Iranians. The Israelis are not, they have a nuclear arsenal. The US government won't acknowledge it because that would mean we would have to cut off aid to Israel, but the Israelis are willing to use nukes against the Iranians. And so is Tehran willing to trade Gaza for Tehran? I just don't believe that's the case at this point. And so Netanyahu has the geopolitical situation of his dreams in front of him. He now has somebody in the White House who a significant portion of his election fund was paid for by Miriam Adelson, a woman who wants to see the West Bank annexed by Israel. And of course, if we're talking about annexing the West Bank, remember that Jesse Waters clip, the demographic problem. They cannot annex the West Bank and treat the Palestinians as normal citizens. They can't annex the West Bank with the Palestinians still being there. They have to expel them first. And with Trump in the White House, I truly believe Netanyahu is getting what he wants. This is a point that I've been making for about a year now, as I saw that Netanyahu was going to keep the war going through the election because he basically had everything he wanted politically in the United States. We're running through the election, both candidates, Trump and Biden, and then Trump and Harris, were essentially arguing over who was the more pro-Israeli president, who was going to support Tel Aviv more. And when that was the debate, as Israel's committing a genocide, Netanyahu would have been absolute fool to stop the fighting. And as I said, the fighting in Gaza stopped just before Trump was inaugurated as president. Now, we'll get into in a few minutes here, it seems that that's going in the wrong direction. There's another point I think I have to make on all of this is that, of course, Congress is also very controlled by AIPAC and the Israeli influence. And so this is a quote from a AIPAC staffer, MJ Rosenberg, and he said AIPAC's overreaching strategy was to prevent any criticism of Israel by pretty much anyone of influence, whether in government or not. Accordingly, they had a war room where one guy had the whole staff devoted to tracking down negative statements by journalists and celebrities of any kind. McCarthyite tactics were always in their bag of tricks. If you got in their way, they rolled over you. This goes back to when I was there. And then let's go to this next tweet from AIPAC Tracker, where they basically just show that over 300 members of Congress, of the majority, take money from AIPAC, take money from the Israeli lobby. And so this is the situation that Netanyahu sees in front of him, where not only is the region completely placated at this point, but the United States of America, Capitol Hill, is not maybe owned by Israel, but Israel has significant influence over a majority of Congress. And when you look at this situation, also the fact that young Americans are turning against the support for Israel, they're increasingly sympathetic of the Palestinians. He realizes that this status quo will not be in place forever, and now is the time for him to act. So I think over the next 4 years, we're not only going to see the erasure of the Palestinian people from the Gaza Strip, but also from the West Bank. And so before we end today, I do want to talk about some of the news from Gaza and Trump, his statements over recent days. Let's play this first clip of Trump talking about all hell breaking loose.
Is it delay that, sir? Should the ceasefire then be off?
Well, I would say this, and I'm going to let that because that's Israel's decision. But as far as I'm concerned, if all of the hostages aren't returned by Saturday at 12 o'clock, I think it's an appropriate time. I would say cancel it and all bets are off and let hell break out. I'd say they ought to be returned by 12 o'clock on Saturday. And if they're not returned, all of them, not in drips and drabs, not 2 and 1 and 3 and 4 and 2. Saturday at 12 o'clock, and after that, I would say all hell is going to break out.
So this is Donald Trump breaking his own Gaza ceasefire deal. So the original agreement was a 3-phase deal. And in phase 1 of that deal, there was a gradual release of, I think, about half of the living Israeli people who were thought to be Israeli hostages held in Gaza who are still living. About 33 of them were going to be released. And it was going to be a slow release where a certain number are released every week. And in exchange, Israel was going to release Palestinian hostages, detainees, and this was supposed to be how the transaction went. Trump just went and completely blew this up and says the Palestinians now must go and unilaterally release all the Israeli hostages or all hell will break loose. And so this is problematic for a number of reasons. One, it's greenlighting Netanyahu to go back to the killing in Gaza. And of course, as this was admitted by the New York Times, the Israelis are not living up to their end of the ceasefire deal. They're supposed to be in negotiations about phase 2, where you see the second half of the hostages released under the original agreement. That's not happening. Additionally, Trump so quickly going back on his own proposal is probably something that concerns Vladimir Putin and anybody else who may negotiate with Donald Trump if he can't even see this first phase of the agreement all the way through. Now let's go to the second half of that clip.
I don't think they're going to do it. I think a lot of them are dead. I think a lot of the hostages are dead. I think it's a great human tragedy what's happened, how people can be that mean to do.
Mr. President, when you say all hell is going to break loose, are you speaking about retaliation from
You'll
Israel?
find out, and they'll find out too. Hamas will find out what I mean.
Mr. President,
They're going to find out what I mean. These are sick people, and they'll find out what I mean Saturday at 12 o'clock.
But no involvement.
So I'm not sure how he came up with that deadline, which is also concerning, but he's saying that I'm giving them this deadline and I don't think they're going to do it. it's really wild. And of course, Hamas had just announced that they were going to allow or withhold the next release of Israeli hostages, as Israel wasn't upholding their end of the agreement. They were supposed to be allowing in, I believe, 200,000 new tents for the Palestinians. They had only allowed in 10% of that number. They were supposed to be allowing in aid every day, and they had started to restrict the aid flows into Gaza. And most importantly, they're supposed to allow in 60,000 temporary housing units, and none of those were allowed in. And so the Israelis clearly weren't living up to their end of the agreement. Also, when Trump is talking about this, he's talking about the state of the Israeli hostages that were released. And certainly the last three hostages, the three male hostages, were they looked like they had not eaten very much in quite some time. However, if you look at the images of the Israeli Palestinian hostages that were released by Israel, they have also been in very rough shape, and some of them were forced to go immediately to the hospital. Some of them have scabies. And one of the important differences here is that people in Gaza are starving to death, and no Israelis are at the risk of starving to death. And so these Israeli hostages being severely malnourished, well, that doesn't mean they're necessarily worse off than the average Palestinian in the Strip, where the Palestinian captives of Israel are significantly worse off than everybody living around them. Now, I have one more clip of Trump, one of the other more outrageous things he said in the past week. We got to talk about this.
You've said before that the U.S. would buy Gaza, and today you just said we're not going to buy Gaza.
We're not going to have to buy. We're going to have Gaza. We don't have to buy. There's nothing to buy. We will have Gaza.
What does that mean?
No reason to buy. There is nothing to buy. It's Gaza. It's a war-torn area. We're going to take it. We're going to hold it. We're going to cherish it. We're going to get it going eventually, where a lot of jobs are going to be created for the people in the Middle East. It's going to be for the people in the Middle East, but I think it can be a diamond. It can be an absolute tremendous asset for the Middle East. And you're going to have peace. It's going to bring peace in the Middle East. Gaza, the way it is right now, every 10 years, you're going to have the same thing happening. I've watched it so long, all the death and destruction of Gaza. The civilization's been wiped out in Gaza. No, it's going to be a tremendous thing. It's fronting on the sea. It's going to be a great economic development job. It's going to put people to work, a lot of people to work. And those people are all going to be from the Middle East.
And just
He wouldn't put people to work. Those people are going to be from the Middle East. Put the Palestinians to work. They would be happy to rebuild the Strip, to rebuild their home. But no, Trump is saying this is going to be a great thing. He's talking about cleansing the Palestinians from Gaza. That is in no way a great thing. That is a horrific act. And again, Trump makes it sound so simple that we're just going to move them. They're going to be happy to leave. No, they are not. This is their homeland. They are not going to leave. They are going to fight, and they are going to do everything they possibly can to try to stay. And so before I wrap up today's show, I want to mention this article from 972 magazine, and to kind of go through it and talk about some of the tactics that Israel has used in this war, this time in Gaza. This article is titled, "Bomb the Area, Gas the Tunnels, Israel's Unbridled War on Gaza's Underground." And the quotes in here are just absolutely disturbing. And remember, this is from 972 magazine. This is an Israeli outlet. In no way can this be called Hamas propaganda or lies. These are Israeli sources talking about what is reported in this article. So the quote here: the Israeli army intensively bombarded residential areas in Gaza when it lacked intelligence on the exact location of Hamas commanders hiding underground, and intentionally weaponized toxic byproducts of bombs to suffocate militants in their tunnels. An investigation by 972 magazine and local call can reveal. Some of these strikes, which were the deadliest of the war and often used American bombs, are known to have killed Israeli hostages despite concerns raised ahead of time by military officers. Moreover, the lack of precise intelligence meant that at least 3 major strikes, the army dropped several 2,000-pound bunker-busting bombs that killed scores of civilians, part of a strategy known as tilling, without successfully killing the intended targets. 3 Israeli hostages were definitively killed by asphyxiation as a result of the November 10th, 2023 bombing that targeted a neighborhood Hamas brigade commander in northern Gaza. And so the army used their families that at the time of the bombing, it was unaware that the hostages were being held near the target. However, three sources with knowledge of the strike, which was led by the Shin Bet, told 972 and local call there were ambiguous intelligence indicating that the hostages may be in the vicinity, yet the attack was authorized. According to SID's sources, this was not an isolated case, but one of dozens of Israeli airstrikes that endangered or killed hostages. To maximize the chances of assassinating a target, the army command authorized the killing of hundreds of Palestinian civilians in these strikes, which according to the sources were carried out in coordination with American officials who received live updates on the approved collateral damage figures. And so, I mean, this whole thing is absolutely horrifying. Israel is using chemical weapons, killing people by suffocating them to death, including Israeli hostages. Trump is talking about how, oh, all the hostages are dead because Hamas is so horrible. All the hostages are dead because Israel used chemical weapons against them. They knowingly did that. This was intentional. They understood what would happen if they dropped multiple 2,000-pound bunker-busting bombs on an area, that it would create this chemical weapons reaction and lead to asphyxiation. And it ended up killing some Israeli hostages. And so this is absolutely horrific. These are terrorist tactics that Israel is engaging in here. And yet, when the American officials are alerted of this information, they act in accordance with Israel. They're not raising the concern. This isn't something that causes the U.S. to withdraw support from Tel Aviv. In fact, this happened well over a year ago, and we're still shipping Israel these weapons. In fact, Trump has authorized a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel since becoming president. So, everybody, thank you all so much for tuning in to the Kyle Lanslow Show today. We'll be back with another episode soon. Please take a minute to like and subscribe the show. Share it out if you're listening, repost it on Twitter, whatever you could do. All that will help us gain a little bit momentum, a little bit bigger audience here, and we'll continue to bring you more episodes.